Okay. Like I say, we're expecting some more people here for long. Actually, our trivia guy's not here yet. Greg Lucas is always the first one to be here. And I just called him on the phone and didn't answer, so hopefully he's on the way. I know he's excited about his college basketball team is going to play a big game this week. Couple things that we need to mention at first. Larry, we appreciate you bringing in your friend. Want to introduce your friend?
Yes, I do. Tommy Irvin. Who didn't come into this meeting years ago, but you just figured out, well, we were playing golf the other day, and here you go.
Great, well, happy to have you.
Thank you.
And we have a special deal for folks of our vintage. So that's good. We also have 3 new members since last time. Robert Pinion, who you know, Mike, who's one of our Houston Babies vintage team. Adam Scardino and Kenneth Snell are 3 new members. So we're always happy to add folks to the group. Our next meeting has been scheduled for the 3rd Monday in December, which is December 20th. Now, there's been some discussion that might be a little bit too close to Christmas. So an alternate has been suggested of the 13th of December, but we can't use this facility that day. They're already booked. They are available the next day on the 14th, Tuesday. So do you have any serious objections to moving one day?
No.
Okay, good.
Me don't you?
Yeah, the only problem is our speaker, I've already changed the dates on him twice. So we'll have to go back one more time. That's the way it works. Also, I'd like to tell you about the fact that SABR has organized a chapter leaders meeting, which comes up every quarter. We had the first one this past Friday. We had 21 chapter leaders on the conference call, and it was very, very productive. They asked 3 people to talk about their chapter, and I was one of the ones that was selected to talk about our chapter. Basically, they wanted to know how we were able to get so many good guests. And so I told them to thank Larry Dierker and Bill Brown and some other folks.
You did a great job too.
Say what?
You did a great job too.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We've tried to have a guest speaker every meeting, and it's worked out pretty good for the last 18 years. One other thing I thought you might want to know about, Deacon Jones is still having some problems with his health. And I try to keep in touch with him on a regular basis. And he was talking to me the other day about something that happened to him that just thrilled him to death. He was home during the World Series, and he got a phone call from Dusty Baker. Now, Dusty had a lot of other things to think about, obviously, during the World Series, but he took the time to call Deacon Jones to wish him well. And Deacon was thrilled to death. And I know some of the rest of you have also called Deacon, and I think that's really good. Hopefully he'll spring back to mid-season form here shortly, but he has had a tough time. The other thing I need to mention is the fact that our Shooting Star Express, the 5th edition, the fall edition, is out. It came out Friday, and we've already had some comments on the newsletter. We got to thank Scott and Tony, and there's Tony, for putting it together. It's very informative. Got a great article about Joe West, a great article about Bill Brown, and talks about the Houston Babies, which is our vintage team. So hats off to those guys that helped put that together. And of course, that means that now that we have the fall issue out, we need to start working on the spring issue. And so we welcome and encourage anybody who would like to make a presentation.
Where is that by late January? Article by January, that's all.
Okay.
Thank you, letter, Canal School.
Yeah, if Charles Hill, yeah, maybe we'll get one. He's maybe writing it right now. I'm not sure. Charles Hill in this minute. Okay. A couple of months ago, I had the opportunity to tune into the SABR meeting in Cleveland, and they had a speaker there, Dr. Christopher Phillips, who just intrigued the heck out of me with his book that I have now purchased. So we made a sale. It's called Scouting and Scoring. And it's just a real detailed book on the impact that scouting and scoring, meaning analytics, have had on baseball from way back in the 1860s. He talks about how scoring first started, and then he talks about how the individual criteria to judge and score players has taken place, and how both parties are necessary to make good decisions on players, especially at the amateur level. When you got to decide, does this guy have potential to play professionally? Does he have the potential to play in the major league level? So, Chris, we're looking forward to your discussion, and we're happy to have you with us. Chris is in Pittsburgh, and I hope the weather's decent up there. I don't know. No, it's not. But we're thrilled to have you, and I want to turn the meeting over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Am I coming through okay, volume wise? All right, great. I'm gonna do the Zoom trapeze walk and try and share my screen here. All right, let me know if you can see that now. Is it coming through okay? Yeah.
Yes, we can. See. Yes, we're good.
Great. So thank you very much for the invitation. I very much appreciate it. I did want to talk to you today from this book, Scouting and Scoring, and give you a little sense of some of the questions I had as I was thinking about it, and hopefully get some of your feedback, some of your thoughts. I put Craig Biggio's card up here, not because I'm pandering, but actually because I used him to organize the book. It just so happened he was up for the Hall of Fame when I started, or when I was in the early stages of working on this project. And so I was trying to really think through how we knew that Craig Biggio was good. And he was an easy case. We all knew he was good, but how did we know, and at what point did we know? Did we know when he was in college? Did we know when he was in his early years? Did we know only after a certain number of years had passed? And then try to really get to what we might think of as the deeper question, which is how we know about anything at all, right? How do you know what surgeon to go to? Do you take recommendations from your friends? Do you look at statistics from Medicare and Medicaid? How do we know quality, and how do we measure quality? And so that was the underlying question. And I like baseball, so I decided to use baseball as my example to try and get to that. By profession, I'm actually a historian of science. So I study the history of statistics, the history of data, the history of decision-making in the sciences. And so baseball for me was a fun way to get to some of these bigger questions. So what I want to start out here is this distinction between scouting and scoring. I think most of us will be familiar with the movie, the book Moneyball, where you have scouts are old, they are grizzled, they tell stories, they have human knowledge. And on the other side, the analytics team, it's Brad Pitt, right? They're young, they're beautiful, they're smart, they know math, they know how to get data. And there's a kind of deep distinction that's made in that book and movie, partly because Michael Lewis is a great storyteller and every story needs a David and Goliath, but also because there was an assumption that there really is something different between what scouts are doing and what scorers are doing, or what analytics departments are doing. But what I found as I started to look at the history of scouting and scoring is that they're actually far more similar than you might think at first glance. And so that's really got me interested in this whole project, to try and think about the history of these two ways of measuring excellence in baseball. And I wanted to use amateur scouting as my test case. That is to say, how do we know which high school and college players are going to be excellent? And then in turn, how do we know which ones who've made it to the major leagues are playing at a high level? How to build a team up. I don't need to tell people who are interested in the Astros that it's, of course, the merger of analytics and scouting, of people knowledge and number knowledge that ultimately drives the best teams. But on some level, the way we talk about these two practices is still very different. So when I was beginning research on the book, Craig Biggio, as I mentioned, was up for the Hall of Fame. And one of the data points that everyone pulled out when they were talking about his candidacy is that he had the most doubles of any right-handed player in history. Now, this is a pretty simple thing to say about somebody. It's not exactly wins above replacement. It's not some sort of fancy StatCast data point. It's a counting data point. It's as simple as you can get. But if you think about it for more than a minute, that's actually a hard thing to know. It requires that you know every right-handed player who's ever played Major League Baseball, and that you know every single hit that they've ever recorded, or at least every double that they've ever recorded. And you need to know that going back to the 1870s. That is to say, long before TV or radio, let alone Bill James or statistics. You need it going back all the way to the earliest days of the game to know that, in fact, Craig Biggio had the most doubles of any right-handed player in history. And so, like many historians, I just started by asking the kind of silly, stupid questions. And the first stupid question I ask is, where did the double originate? Who started keeping track of things like doubles? And the answer, at least in its first incarnation, is official scorers. That is to say, people who keep track of the runs on the field. So this is a baseball rule book from 1866. And you can see on the frontispiece there, the picture at the beginning, there are two scorers on the field. In fact, originally there was one scorer from each team to make sure they kept each other honest. And this was even before the first professional leagues in the 1870s. And the figure I discovered, and many of you will already know about him, some of you may know more than I know about him, but the figure I discovered who is most crucial for this transformation is a gentleman named Henry Chadwick. Henry Chadwick immigrated from England. He was a cricket player until he immigrated, and then he switched over to baseball. And he lived in the greater New York area in Brooklyn. And that was one of the hotbeds of baseball in the 1840s and 50s when he was first getting familiar with the American sporting scene. The interesting thing about Henry Chadwick is, well, two interesting things from my perspective. One is that he's a newspaperman, and newspapermen want to sell newspapers. And so he was trying to figure out how to sell baseball to newspapers. And then the second interesting thing about him is that he was from a family of reformers, what we might think of as kind of political progressives, although it doesn't have the same connotation today as it did then. But the idea was that if you have something you want to change in the world, the way you change it is to keep track of data. And so you record data, you figure out how to change it, and then you go about that. In fact, for most historians who aren't interested in baseball, we know Henry Chadwick's half-brother Edwin, mainly because he kept data on public health in England. And probably the most important 19th century document of public health was written by Edwin Chadwick in 1842, in the same period that Henry was moving to the United States and interested in baseball. And in fact, Edwin wrote about Henry, while I have been trying to clean up the streets of London, get the filth off the streets, my brother has been keeping up the family reputation by trying to clean your sports. That is to say, baseball. To make baseball something, in the words of Henry Chadwick, that was scientific and manly. That was, in a way, something that would live up to its name as a scientific sport. You might imagine from the earliest days of baseball, most scorekeeping did not involve doubles. No one cared how many doubles were hit. All they cared about is how many outs and how many runs were recorded. You need to know outs in order to know when the game's over, and you need to know runs in order to know who wins. So this is one of the first existing scorebooks we have. This is at the New York Public Library from 1845. And you can see it's a relatively simple accounting of who scores or who records the outs and how many runs are recorded. And then at the bottom are 2/3 of the way down. I don't know how it's coming through on the screen there, but basically it records that 26 runs resulted in a winning by 2 runs. And so they ultimately won the game, the Knickerbockers did, 26-24. This is what early scorekeeping looked like. 15 years later, after Henry Chadwick got his hands on scorekeeping looked entirely different. And so here by 1860, again, this is over a decade before the first professional leagues in baseball, Now scorekeeping is a whole different kettle of fish. So you have outs and runs, but then you also have how each player was put out and how all the putouts were recorded. So you have both offensive and defensive statistics here in order to try and measure how well people played the game. That is to say, not just measure what the end result of the game was, but to actually try and figure out how people played the game. Chadwick was very interested in promoting this, partly because he was selling newspapers, and one way to sell newspapers is to anoint players the best player, so that you have to buy the newspaper, then you argue with the newspaper, and this, of course, today, as well as in the 1860s, controversy sells. And so part of the reason he was interested was to promote the scorekeeping within his various newspapers. He also wanted to sell pre-printed score sheets. So those are the two of the reasons, at least, he was very interested in this. And of course, he argued that only his score sheets would provide a full analysis of the game in a uniform manner. But for me, as a historian, what I was interested in is how he thought scoring should happen. And the first rule of scoring for Chadwick is that scoring should involve gentlemen. It should be, a scorer should be someone whose gentlemanly conduct will render him acceptable. That is to say, you need somebody reliable, ultimately because you're making judgments about worth. And he makes this very clear in his own scorebooks from the 1860s. He didn't care necessarily who got which out. He wanted to know how the outs were recorded. He wanted to measure skill. And what he did, in the words of another historian, Jules Teigel, was turn baseball into a morality play. He wanted to know who made errors, who made good hits, who made mediocre hits. He wanted to record the data that would enable him to make judgments about the players. So a second answer, in addition to just official scores, of why people kept track of doubles, is that it was a way for Henry Chadwick to keep track of a batter's skill. That is to say, to measure how skilled a batsman was at the game. And there were big debates in the 1860s and 1870s about how to measure skill, whether you would measure skill by number of hits or by number of bases, or by the number of runners who you moved around the bases, or the number of runners you hit in ahead of you, et cetera. And so big debates. The important thing from my perspective is that all the debates were about data. That is to say, they were about how you collect data. But the data was not some free-floating, we collect data in order to feed it into a computer. The data was always collected by humans to make judgments about other humans. That's why they collected data. It was always a kind of moral judgment. Essentially, from Chadwick's day to the 2010s, nowadays it's slightly different, only since 2015, but from 1860 until 2015, scorekeeping essentially worked the same way. You'd have a scorer assigned to the game. He or she would keep track of the score during the game and then would actually mail the score sheet. By about 2005, they were allowed to fax them. But in general, you'd mail them to the league office. And then the league office would record in their own books the records of every day's games. And so on the left here, you can see the National League day-by-day ledgers, or the daily ledgers that are still kept at the Baseball Hall of Fame. And what would happen is, for each player, you'd record the number of singles, doubles, triples. And then for a team, of course, you total them across each day and then across the season. And this is by and large how scorekeeping was kept from Chadwick's time to the present. So that's one answer, at least, of where these doubles come from. They come from a ton of people caring about measuring excellence in baseball, going back to the 1860s. There's another answer, though, about how we know about this 668 in particular. That is to say, those of you who have ever used baseball reference, maybe you are not like me and you just don't care about these things, but you might ask yourself, where does baseball reference get its numbers from? Are they official numbers? Are they numbers that kind of kept by amateurs? And the short answer is that when Baseball Reference went online almost 20 years ago, they got their information, their data, that is to say, they got their numbers from a now defunct website run by Sean Lehman called the Baseball Archive. This is what the websites looked like in 1997, so apologies for it being a little hard to read there, but what Sean's Layman Baseball Archive was is essentially a database that Sean put online for anyone to use. But then you can ask yourself, where did Sean get the data? And the answer is Sean stole the data. Sean scraped the data off the Total Baseball 1994 CD-ROM edition. And so what he did is he took the images in this CD-ROM, took all the numbers off the CD-ROM, and then uploaded them into his own relational database. Technically, I should be clear, it's not stealing because facts have no copyrighted status. Only the presentation of facts can be copyrighted. So Sean made very clear to check that before doing it. But then you might ask yourself, where did Total Baseball get these stats from? How did they know that Craig Biggio had 668 doubles? And the answer is Pete Palmer. You come back to a human. Pete Palmer kept a database on his own personal computer. This is what it looked like in the 1980s. And before, this is what it looked like. He had 30,000 punched cards where Pete Palmer kept track of all the data that was kept on those National League and American League dailies. The short answer of why he kept track is that he's an obsessive, but the long answer is that he actually had access to latest computing technology in his day job with Raytheon. He actually was monitoring a satellite. So they were looking for Russian missiles. It's a very Cold War story. But when the satellite was not in range, when it was not functioning, then the computer had downtime, and he used that downtime essentially to create his database and then check it. And what he discovered was that the National League and American League records had tens of thousands of errors, simple errors, things like a team's hits wouldn't add up if you added up each player's hits, or a player's hits over the years would not be the same. A player's hits over a career, would not be the same as a player's hits year by year if you added them all up. And so what he did was recruit people like you and people like me, that is to say the newly founded Society for American Baseball Research. He called us his gremlins, and he'd send his gremlins all over the country looking for newspaper records, looking for ways they could actually fix all the records of Major League Baseball, that is to say, to correct them. And so this is another way we might think about scoring here as a people-driven science, as driven a lot more by humans than you might think by the classic image of analytics being all data all the time, where humans are left out. Some of you, I'm happy to talk more about this. You'll know more about StatCast, which has come online in the last few years. And you might think to yourself, oh, StatCast records it automatically. We no longer need humans to record it. But this is in fact not the case. So the offices of StatCast are in Chelsea Market in Manhattan, and dozens of people work there around the clock cleaning the StatCast data to actually make sure that the data StatCast sends out is accurate and hasn't been recorded incorrectly. And so again, you have people behind the analytics constantly. But there's another sense in which the data that StatCast produces has people behind it. And that is to say, at least up until 2015, things have changed a little bit since then, but until 2015, this is a screenshot of the data each team got every morning from the previous game, the play-by-play. And that data actually is recorded in a particular code. And that code dates back to Project Scoresheet from the 1980s. Some of you may be familiar with this. Some of you may have volunteered for Project Scoresheet. It was Bill James inspired, but volunteer run in the 1980s. And the idea was to collect the play-by-play of each game. Until the 1980s, there was no play-by-play publicly available. And so all the data was simply box score level data, where you could find out how many doubles were hit. But for instance, if you wanted to know whether Craig Biggio hit more doubles against left-handed hitters or left-handed pitchers or right-handed pitchers, you couldn't know that because there was no play-by-play data. And so starting in the 1980s, the effort was to have a scorer at home or in the ball game, on the ballpark, watching every game at every stadium around the country, recording the play-by-play data. This was produced in these large books that then you could buy. And interestingly, the Project Scoresheet coding, which was developed in 1987 by Tom Tippett, who later worked for the Red Sox, but then had his own simulation game, which some of you may have played, called Diamond Mines Baseball. And David Nichols, who was actually a CMU computer science grad student right here in Pittsburgh. they developed this coding syntax that would allow people to actually use the code so that all the data could be centralized and put into computers in the 1980s. And that is exactly the same data that then went into the StatCast system. So again, even though StatCast is quite fancy, it has these video recordings, it can tell you speed of every player, the trajectory and arc of every ball. It's built on the back of this individual human effort to just record play-by-play, person by person. And so for me, when I think about the question of the most right-handed doubles of any, the most doubles, excuse me, of any right-handed player in history, what I'm thinking about is that this seems like it's just a number. It doesn't seem like there's any people behind it at all. But in fact, there are people who need to record the number. And one thing I can happily talk more about is the distinction between hits and errors, which of course, not every player who reaches second gets credit for a hit. And that's a human level distinction as well, that is going to be almost impossible to replace by computers, even with StatCast. All the way up to how are these data collected at the league office? How are these data collected when you get to the level of somebody like Pete Palmer? How does a website like Baseball Reference get created? And the answer is there's bureaucratic, individual human expertise at every layer. And it's very, very hard to disentangle the reliability of numbers from the reliability of the people behind them. So that's one half of the equation that I was interested in when I started this book. The other half of the equation was the part about scouting, to really think about scouting. And in the case of Craig Biggio, now you're no longer looking at, say, his cards, his baseball cards, the back of the baseball card, but now you're looking at, say, scouting reports. That is to say, how did individual humans, that is to say, scouts, know that Craig Biggio was going to be an excellent or even a passable major league player? But the first thing I did when I was interested in scouting, and in particular scouting of Craig Biggio, is I went and found the scouting reports on Craig Biggio. Here's one from his senior year in 1987. And the interesting thing about the scouting reports on Craig Biggio is that they were full of numbers. So here is this scouting enterprise, and there were numbers all over it. And it really surprised me because I knew that the numbers had people all over it by this point in time, but I didn't expect the people knowledge to have numbers all over it. And so what I want to do now is talk through this report for a few minutes with you and give you a little bit of the history of scouting to try and really understand how these reports were created and why these reports are so heavily dependent on numbers, which is not something that most of us think about when we think about scouting. And the most obvious way that scouting involves numbers is what a player is worth. And so this is right here on the sheet. Tom Farrick, the scout for Kansas City, thought that Craig Biggio was worth $55,000 to $60,000. That's what he thought the bottom line was. That dictated, at least in the 1980s, approximately where you should draft Craig Biggio and what kind of bonus you should be prepared, or what kind of signing deal you should be prepared to offer Craig Biggio. And so on a kind of very basic level, money is at the heart of scouting, which is something we all know. But this goes back all the way to the beginning of the game, beginning of the scouting game, I should say, not the beginning of baseball. So even by 1910, in this classic book, which anyone can get online now, called Touching Second by John J. Evers and Hugh Fullerton, Inside Play in Big League Baseball. It's really a quite fun book. They discuss how each club already by 1910 had a scouting force whose duty was to scour the entire country, seeking men by who they're playing show promise. And in this first period of the history of scouting, really up until the 1960s, the main job of the scout was to put a dollar sign on the muscle. That is, to assign a value to every player he would scout. And so this is by and large what scouting reports look like from the 1910s until the 1960s. They look like letters to the general manager or letters to the front office. I've taken this one from the very end of that period. It's a scouting report on Rod Carew from 1964. And I pulled out a couple quotes just to give you a sense of the language used. This is Herb Stein, who worked for the Twins, the relatively recently created Twins at that point. I have seen this boy in a number of games during this period, and the following evaluation is submitted. Physically, he has a fine body, wiry type. He has no known injuries or physical defects. These are the kinds of words we normally associate with scouts. But at the bottom, he's quite clear. I am prepared to offer this boy a cash bonus of $5,000 and $400 per month. My relationship with him is good and have a good chance of signing him. So at the end of the day, what scouts did was assign a value to the player, and then they wrote to the front office and made sure they had permission to give that player that amount of money. And so most of scouting in this early first half of the century mode was about selling the team to the player. That is to say, you approached an individual player who's a free agent, they're amateur at that point, and you say, you should come play for the Twins. And maybe your best thing to say about the Twins is that you offer $5,000. Or maybe you say that the Twins really need outfielders or whatever it is. And so you try and actually sell the team to the individual player. And by and large, the main way you do that is through settling on a number. Of course, it's important to know what the player's number is, and it's important to know what your boss's number is if you're one of these area scouts. That is to say, you always want the player's number to be lower than your boss's number. And so you try and figure out what the player is willing to accept. And then you tell your boss what the player is really worth. And of course, you want to offer less than that. But this was not just a kind of off-the-cuff operation. So somebody like Rod Carew had been followed by Herb Stein for many months. And here's a player information card that he had filled out on Herb Stein earlier that year in 1964. And you can really see quite clearly that he's putting down the information about him, his date of birth, his address, that sort of information. But he's also making very clear about his judgment. He's good all the way. He should move right into A ball. And you can see the kinds of classic people knowledge for scouting here. This is the kind of scouting we're familiar with, where people are really discussing scouting as a way of making judgments about young men playing baseball, essentially. But all of this changed in scouting after 1965. The entire world of scouting was upended. And sometimes when you talk with scouts after 1965, at least the old timers, most of whom are no longer with us now, but the old timers would always complain about the institution of the Major League Draft. It made scouting really a bummer as far as they were concerned. I'll just remind you, the Major League Draft in 1965 was by and large meant to address the ongoing problem of bonuses being offered to a relatively small number of players by a relatively small number of clubs. So the very top players were all being gobbled up by the richest clubs. And then what they do is they'd stockpile their farm teams. And so this is what Branch Rickey famously called a ripening. You'd ripen players into money, and either they would come play for you at the major league level, or you could sell them off. And because of the reserve clause, players had no control over their labor. So once they signed with the team had complete control over that player's labor. And so all of scouting essentially went into that initial signing process. And then once you had a player on a team, you could just keep them in the minor leagues and then sell them or trade them or bring them up as you wished. But after 1965, now a player who was drafted by a team, if they didn't sign with that team, they'd have to wait an entire year of eligibility. And so they'd have to forfeit an entire year of eligibility before they'd be able to play Major League Baseball. And so immediately after the institution of the Major League Draft, pricing was suddenly way less important than ranking. And what I mean by that is that you don't care exactly how much each player should be offered. You care who you should pick first among all the remaining players. That's the crucial question. Once you pick a player, then you can negotiate on price. But as the club, as the team, you have the upper hand, because if a player doesn't sign with you, he's got to wait out a whole nother year. And so you really have all the cards once you draft a particular player. And so this changes scouting dramatically. Now clubs, instead of going out to try and find a player like Rod Carew or to try and find some other future superstar, now clubs have to wait their turn as they draft players. And as a result, scouts can't just go out and sell the team to the player. Scouts now do the exact opposite. They sell the player to the team. You're now trying to convince your own team to draft the player that you've seen. And so scouting now turns from a kind of financial negotiation into a data gathering operation. And so the job of the scout is to gather enough data to convince your team to draft a particular player as high as possible. And you can notice this change almost immediately in the scouting manuals. So the Texas Scouting Manual described objectivity now as more important than judgment. You need to be objective. You don't have to say whether the player is going to be a superstar. You just have to be objective in how good the player is right now, and then we'll decide when to draft them. The Philadelphia Phillies described, again, objectivity, whereas the Chicago Cubs described scouts as being diggers in information. That is to say, these data gatherers. And then almost immediately after the draft, you have the creation of what's called centralized scouting. And so you get the Central Scouting Bureau initially, a very short-lived Central Scouting Bureau, and then the still existing, although slowly dying, Major League Scouting Bureau from the mid-1970s. And the idea behind these is pretty predictable. If a team has to draft 30 players over 30 rounds, a team may know who to draft in the first few rounds, but most teams have no idea who to draft after the 10th round. And so how do you go out to figure out all these players around the country that you might not have time to see? Well, you buy or you rent or you subscribe to a centralized bureau to tell you about all the players that you're probably not going to have time to see. But here's the catch. If you're getting scouting reports from a centralized bureau, how does that bureau communicate with all these different teams? And the short answer is that the bureau uses numbers, because numbers are the easiest way to communicate clearly across lots of different people. And so what the Central Scouting Bureau and Major League Scouting Bureau do is they essentially invent the use of numbers on scouting reports. Here's just a couple more dates, just in case you're interested. In the pooled scouting begins around 1964, but Central Scouting Bureau really takes off in 68. And then the Scouting Bureau is in 74. This is what the very first Central Scouting Bureau scouting reports look like. So you can see how different it is. Rod Carew's scouting report is only 4 years before this. And now you have a report that it's standardized. Instead of letting the scouts describe a player's fielding ability, they provide the words and a scout just circles them. A scout, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, a scout has to make a hole punch for what position the player plays so that a team can look at all the second basemen very quickly just by lining up the scouting reports and seeing where the holes are. In the bottom left-hand corner, you might be able to see there's another hole punch describing a prospect as definite, as a good prospect, as a chance major leaguer, or as a potential prospect, which is what this particular player, Tom Heintzelman, was described as. And so all of a sudden now, scouting is very, very different. You're not negotiating on whether to offer Tom Heintzelman $5,000. What you're negotiating on is with the central administration of the central bureaucracy of the team, trying to convince them at what round, if any, should they draft Tom Heintzelman? Kind of where does he fit into the draft process? That is to say, how good is he compared to all the other prospects that they're considering? The Major League Scouting Bureau took this a step further and actually computerized their scouting reports. And one of the first innovations they did in the 1970s was they used what is now the standard scouting 2-to-8 scale. I tried desperately to figure out the origins of this 2-to-8 scale. I never could, although my current, my best guess is that it's based on the SAT, which at that point was increasingly popular in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And the SAT also uses a 200 to 800 scale that's always normalized at 500, which is precisely what the Major League Scouting Bureau scale was. 5 was considered major league average, 8 was considered essentially all-star, and 2 is considered well below major league average. And so what they would do is they would take a player's information here and they would rate him on all these different abilities. In this case, you have a position player, and so he'd be rated both in the present and in the future on a scale of 2 to 8. You can see a little bit more detail here about how the actual rating took place. And the second thing that the Major League Scouting Bureau did with this is that they took the average of these numbers and called it the overall future potential. That is to say, the overall future potential, or the OFP in the biz, is actually a kind of adjusted average of the future grades for each player. Why did they want a single number, this overall future potential? Well, they wanted a single number for the same reason that we use credit scores. They wanted a single number that provided what purportedly, at least, a kind of overall picture of a player. And if you're a club, of course, this is really important. If you're going to go to a draft and you have 30,000 potential prospects to draft, you want to know who's rated the highest among all those, because that's who you want to draft first. And the easiest way to do that is to assign a single number to every prospect. And that's what the Major League Scouting Bureau did. This is what it looked like in practice. They would take the straight average, and then they could adjust it up or down either way, which is still, up until very recently, how scouts generally operated when they provided these numbers on scouting reports. And so now if you look at this same scouting report on Craig Biggio, now you can start to see some of the different ways that, in fact, this kind of numerical assessment, this essentially quantified mode played out. So the first is his present and future grades. This is Tom Ferrick, a scout for Kansas City Royals. So you can see his hitting ability was given 4, so slightly below major league average. In the present, that is to say, as he was hitting in college, it was a 3. And his running speed was a 7, kind of ironic for a recruited catcher to have that be your top grade. And you can go down and see exactly how they were kind of calibrating these for pitchers and non-pitchers. And the overall future potential was 60. So even though Tom Ferrick, wasn't a kind of by now candidate on Craig Biggio, Tom Ferrick did think that Craig Biggio would be an above average major leaguer. So in that sense, he was right. He indeed ended up being an above average major leaguer. You can also notice some of that kind of classic data that we're now so familiar with. We sometimes forget it's data. The first is the running time to first base. This is recorded as a standard measure on most scouting reports, and also, of course, for pitchers, the guns. The gun reading has an interesting history. Many of you will know from the 1970s when a police officer turned his gun to the radar gun to the field, and then almost immediately it began being recorded as part of the data of pitching. Also, you see some innovations here among the scouts themselves. One is a national double check, the so-called cross checkers, or as they are known by scouts who don't like them, the double crossers. And the cross checkers are the guys who go out to check on individual scouts' work. So in this case, Tom Ferrick is a very, very experienced scout by the late 1980s. And so he's serving here as a national double checker. That is to say, some other scout saw Craig Biggio play, thought he'd be a prospect for the Kansas City Royals. And then he sent Tom Ferrick out to double check to see what Tom Ferrick thought. This enables another form of objectivity because you have 2 different scouts who are giving a number on Craig Biggio. You also have what's common since the 1970s, which is aptitude and psychometric tests. That is to say, things like the athletic motivation inventory. So they were trying to figure out how players thought, whether they were smart, whether they had emotional maturity, whether they had the kind of aggressiveness or teachability that you'd want in a particular player. And so again, this becomes a part of the overall measurement of Craig Biggio's ability to try and measure differences between players. And one thing you can notice about this report is that they were kept. We still have this report, even though it may have occurred to you that Kansas City did not draft Craig Biggio in 1987. That in fact, Kansas City passed over Craig Biggio that year. And so what good is this record? Well, it actually becomes data about the scout. So this can be used to test whether scouts are good. So you can see if scouts are giving high overall future potentials, whether in fact the players they're giving high overall future potentials to really turn out to be good. And so it's a way, again, of providing data on the scouts. And so it's a way for teams to keep track of how good their scouts are. And so this kind of activity that seemed to be so willy-nilly, done by largely overweight men with cigars and hats, is actually a quite data-driven practice if you look at the level of the kinds of decisions they're making about individual players on the ground. One other thing I want to point out is that this report looks almost exactly like the Major League Scouting Bureau's report, and that's not an accident. If you are a club and you're relying on Major League Scouting Bureau reports, you want your reports to look almost exactly alike their reports so that you can use them interchangeably. And so after the Major League Scouting Bureau was created in 1974, almost every team with one or two holdouts adopts the Major League Scouting Bureau report as their report. So essentially all scouting reports are standardized within a few years after the 1970s. Again, a way in which scouting becomes, or tries to become, as objective as possible. So the irony for me is that by the 1980s, scouts are the ones complaining about baseball becoming a numbers game. So Ed Catalinas, these are both from Dollar Sign and the Muscle, Kevin Currain's great book on the history of scout, or in the interviews with scouts, and has a fair amount of information about the history of scouting. So Ed Catalinas describes scouting's more of a numbers game now. Bobby Maddock, clubs have become too scientific. This is not a kind of Bill James analytics war critique. These folks are talking about scouting. Scouting itself had become too scientific, too number driven, too analytic for the way things used to be before the draft. And so coming back to where I started, if you start to kind of think about the way this is often portrayed, who are the scouts, who are the analytics departments, why are they so different? Why is this information so different? It actually doesn't hold up very well. That scouting information looks a lot like scoring information, and scoring information relies on a lot of the same people knowledge that scouting information relies on. There are important differences, and I'm happy to talk more about those, and I'll have lots of time in a minute for questions on those, but I really want to push you to think carefully about how different these practices really are when we're in there keeping score in a stadium, or when we're making judgments about which high school player we're watching is actually going to be the next superstar. What about them is numerical, and what about them is qualitative? One thing that is absolutely true is that scouts do not describe what they do in this way, at least scouts until very recently. And so I have read almost every, I think I've read every, but I hesitate to say that. I've read a lot of scouting memoirs, and scouting memoirs are all essentially the same. They have a pretty solid pun or joke in the title: Diamonds in the Rough, Prophet of the Sandlots, Rhodes Scholar. They make fun of how far they travel, how far they go into the woods to find these players. And then every chapter is the story of them finding another player. And so scouts themselves talk about it not at all as a data-driven enterprise. But if you ask scouts what they do is by and large put numbers on players. That is to say, they turn players into numbers. No different in some ways than Henry Chadwick was ever trying to turn players into numbers as he was working in the 1860s and 70s. And so in this sense, one of the things I'm trying to kind of think about carefully is scouting as a data-driven science. What happens if we think of scouting as a science? And that's, of course, of interest to me as a historian of science. And when I think about scouting as a science, I can think about lots of ways it's a bad science. For instance, scouting is really hard. So, scouting actually, if you were a scout, the best thing you could do, you would be accurate upwards of 95% of the time if every amateur player you looked at, you said was not a major league prospect. You'd be pretty much close to 100% accurate. But that's not very helpful. That doesn't tell you very much, right? The question are, who are those real exceptions? Who are those rare players who actually do make the major leagues. Because even among the players drafted, so only about 8% of players drafted into the major leagues ever play a single day in Major League Baseball. And even among first rounders, the numbers have gotten better. Now it's about 2/3 of first rounders, but for most of the last half of the 20th century after the draft, only about half of first round ball players ever played a single day in the major leagues. So scouting is really hard, and they've been trying to make it better for a long time. And the way they've been trying to make it better, they being teams by and large, is by thinking of it ever more as a data-driven operation. That they don't mean like fundamental equations, not like physics per se. What they mean is like a kind of Google Analytics type thing, where you collect data, you aggregate them, you make predictions, you adjust, you iterate, you do it all again. That's the right model for scouting after the draft. In other words, it's much more numbers driven than we'd expect, given the way most of us talk about scouting. So I want to thank some folks from the Society for American Baseball Research who've helped out with this project. And I think I've left, hopefully, plenty of time for questions, because usually there's lots of good questions. So thank you very much.
Okay, who goes first? Ryan has a question. Got a question. Pick up. Ryan, you're on mute, buddy.
Those are bigs.
No, unmute himself. I think you can.
You talking about me?
Yeah, you were, yeah.
I thought somebody else was okay. Are the major league scouting sheets, are they similar to what they are the ones that you showed, are they similar to the ones that are used today?
Yeah, so scouting reports haven't changed very much. It's hard to get a hold of the recent ones in the last 5 years, and you can quickly work out why that's a hard thing to do. So it works best to get a hold of old scouting reports. But I've talked to many scouts. Now the big difference is that they fill out iPads, which I find absolutely like insanely annoying to have to use iPads for everything. But they use iPads now. But by and large, they're still trying to evaluate in a number placed on a qualitative judgment. So that is to say, you watch somebody hit, and then you try and put a number on that, and then you aggregate those numbers into a single variable. That's still what they do. The main difference now is that there's all this data that gets produced in addition to the scouting data. So the scouting data is one input stream. So in that sense, the reports are very similar. But for example, even at the high school or college level, at the top levels, they're still going to be getting things like, you know, how fast they're swinging, what the exit velocity is, et cetera. They're increasingly using that kind of video-driven data. But the problem is that even that data, even things like exit velocity or, you know, launch angle or, you know, route efficiency for outfielders, if players are as good as they're ever going to be at 18, they're almost certainly never going to be major leaguers. So it continues to be a problem for scouting, because scouting is trying to figure out who's going to be a major leaguer 10 years from now. And it's almost, you can never see, like, there's almost no college or high school athletes that are ready to go into the pros right away. So you're making judgments about development. And so that's where a lot of the scouting report has remained the same, because everyone can see, you know, you can watch the video on a player hitting, and you can get all the data on how fast a player swings or how fast the ball exits off a swing. But what's much harder is to get a judgment about mechanics or a judgment about hitting ability in general that then projects into the future. And so teams are trying to do this. You know, teams would love to be able to put players in a kind of cryogenic chamber and have them do something. I mean, teams have been trying to do this for a long time. So one of the things I talk about in my book is the kind of the history of these tools that are kind of pseudo-scientific tools to try and figure out like who's the best player. Because if we could fire all our scouts, we would absolutely fire all our scouts. That would be what we would do. But they can never figure out something that is actually better than scouts watching amateurs play baseball.
Hey, Chris, I got a question. This is Joe
Joe.
Thompson. Hey, I got, so if somebody wanted to look up the original scouting report for Carlos Correa, where would they find it?
So most current major leaguers are pretty hard to find, in the same way that the clubs just haven't turned it over. But if it exists, you can either ask, the PR department for a team. But what I would do, at least first, is check with the Baseball Hall of Fame, which collects scouting reports. For a long time, they've come back online. But for a long time, they had this kind of unfiltered 40,000 scouting reports online, just as part of their digital collection for the Baseball Hall of Fame. So I would start there. The problem you'll find, though, is that for somebody like him, the teams just will not release recent information. And then when information is deemed to be not recent enough to keep, they throw it away. So it's very, very difficult. So the vast majority of scouting reports that we have were kept in attics or dusty bins by scouts. And then the scouts family would essentially donate them all to the Hall of Fame. And so they're very, very difficult to find for more recent years. But they exist.
Go ahead. Ms. Bob, I was intrigued. You started off by talking about Craig Biggio and his doubles. And of course, most of us have the opportunity to know Craig. The question is, how do players get a error turned into a hit? There is a formal process for that now. You just can't go to the score and say, hey, I disagree with you.
Yeah, so it's changed over time. So it's an interesting process. So for a long time, it was quasi secret. That who the scorer was kept secret sometimes, or at least you had to go up to the press box. You'd find these like managers or bench coasters running up to the press box, trying to figure who the heck was that who assigned that a hit. And sometimes you wouldn't even find out until the paper the next day. And so the hit and score, eventually they required all scorers to announce it, both in the press box and in the stadium. That's why you have that kind of official hit or error that now has to go out. And for years after that, so that happened in the 70s when they started transitioning in the late 70s, early 80s from newspaper reporters to essentially people off the street acting as official scorers for teams. After that transition, you could always complain to a scorer because every scorer had 24 hours to change his or her mind after making a judgment. And so for some of that time, they could look at video, they might have the ability to kind of consult that, maybe think about it. But they had that time to make the change. So you'd complain right after the game is when you'd complain. But what happened is that scorers didn't like this, as you might imagine. And increasingly, players' contracts were tied to performance. And so a couple hits here and there, players started to really care about a couple hits here and there, which they never used to care about, at least in the same way. I mean, some were always obsessive, but most players wouldn't care about them in the same way. And so what happened is that the league office actually instituted a policy where you can formally appeal to the commissioner. And that has, I can go through it in some detail, but it's changed a little bit over the last 10 years. But the bottom line is that you have the scorer has 24 hours to make the judgment. And then you have another 24 hours to contest the judgment after it's made. And essentially what you do is file a complaint with the vice president for baseball operations. And they can do whatever they want to make the decision. They can convene a committee. They can just make it on their own. They can use video evidence, and they can essentially overturn any call now, any judgment call about hit or an error on a stated basis or no basis at all. And so the good news is that it's taken it out of the hands of scorers. That is to say, scorers don't have to be fighting with players. But the bad news is that it's made it a little more complex, opaque to kind of figure out what's going on. But from my kind of historical perspective, it's really interesting because it makes it official, because it's literally the office that gets to decide it. in theory, you could appeal every single hit air call to the office. You could send them all to Major League Baseball. Eventually, they would start finding you. But before then, you could actually appeal all the calls then. So the official here would be literally of the office. But that's how you do it now. You file a complaint with the vice president.
So the final judgment will be made by somebody who knows less about hits and errors than everyone in this room.
That's right. That's right. So, I mean, one of the amazing things about baseball statistics are that people seem to have a lot of amnesia about how hits and errors get made. Because when you're watching the game, I just get angry all the time at hits and errors and how they're assigned. But then 3 weeks later, you're looking at the data talking about some guys, batting average or on base percentage, and you forget that that entire thing has been swayed by that game you were so angry about 3 weeks ago, where one hit or two hits can really make a huge difference, especially with some of these kind of breakdowns in the statistics. And so one of the things, for this crowd, you guys know all this, but for crowds who are less familiar with baseball, one of the things I really emphasize is just how amazing it is that we depend on baseball statistics at all, how they're the kind of model for thinking about the game, given that the vast majority of kind of close calls are made by official scorers who for most of the 20th century didn't have a ton of formal training, but who nevertheless were good enough. They got it right enough of the time to function.
Exactly who can file a complaint? Can it be any player on the team?
That's a good question. So this is regulated by the collective bargaining agreement. And so typically it would be the manager, the player's agent, or the player in question. Those are the three who normally would file. But there are certain circumstances in which the player, the agent, or the manager can designate somebody to complain on their behalf. But it can't be, for example, just you couldn't complain on behalf of the shortstop couldn't complain on behalf of the pitcher because the pitcher's ERA got out of whack because a hit was called an error, or a particular batted ball was called an error or hit. So you have to be involved in the play, or the manager.
I have another question. So you went over that all the stuff that was on the score sheet. Are there things that scouts then and now look for that aren't on the score sheets?
Yeah. So the interesting thing about scouts is that if they don't write it down, it doesn't exist by and large. And so some of it can be done in phone calls. You can imagine a scout calling up the front office and saying, this is a really special kid. But because of the draft, if it's not written down, those sheets are the sheets that they use in the draft room, when they're making those decisions. And so it has to be recorded for it to count. And so there's certainly things, we can go back. I can show you that if there's more questions about it, we can look at that Craig Biggio scouting report. He describes his body, for example, what kind of body he has. So this is very typical. The player will be described as wiry or athletic or small or room to fill out. One of my favorite kind of scouting lore is like this scouting dictionary, people who are described as thick or, stoplight, kind of all the different meanings that are ascribed to players' bodies that are meant to convey something immediately about the player. And so they're way harsher than almost any fan is actually about the players as they look at them. So that's one example of something that body and health, they can reduce some of that to numbers. So for instance, they do give, general exams, medical exams. And so those might have a number associated with overall health, but in general, the descriptions of the body do not. And then the other aspects that are really important for scouts are what's generally called signability. And so players who, let's say it's kind of a player with Scott Boras or, Scott Boras-like figure advising them, they would also record that because that might be very, very important if they're considering being drafted in the first few rounds. So there's certain things there that are definitely irreducibly qualitative, but most other qualitative judgments have to be expressed as a number or else they won't count. So if you say a guy has a great swing, but you've put his future hitting ability as 4, that it just doesn't count that in the notes you write that he has a great swing. because what matters are these numbers that are placed on the values. They also keep you from being wishy-washy, because you can imagine if most of us had the job of watching, even let's say we were at the Cape Cod League, we were watching, definite future major leaguers play, and we had to pick which ones were going to be future major leaguers, we would definitely start being wishy-washy. Oh, kid's got a good arm, but maybe this will have, and so numbers force people to be objective and clear. And so it's a good way of measuring just how good the scouts are.
On that point, that's assuming the factors that you put into everything are weighed exactly the same. If you're looking for a type of player where some of those factors should be weighed higher, like throwing ability for an infielder or something like that, do the teams look at those and reconfigure the numbers, recalculate the numbers based on those types of things, weigh some of the factors?
Yes, so both parts of your question are absolutely the case. So the first part is that calibration is incredibly important. So there used to be a scout school run by the Major League Scouting Bureau to essentially train people to recognize a 5 swing. What is a 5 swing? What is a 7 swing? What is a 3 swing? And so everything has to get calibrated. You can imagine a huge problem if you have 2 scouts sitting next to each other and one is giving a fastball a 6 and the other is giving a fastball a 2. Right? That is not acceptable. So every team worked very hard to calibrate. But then the second part of your question is also right on, that teams may care about certain aspects of the report more than others. So some teams just will not draft people under 5'10", period. Some teams will always look for people with a lot of upside in hitting, no matter what their fielding ability is. So not every 80 OFP is the same. Not every 60 OFP is the same. And so teams, what they'll do is they'll lay out all the 60, at least the ones I spoke to, will lay out all the 60 OFPs, and then they'll prioritize the 60 OFPs from top to bottom based on what they care about. Do they really want defense? Do they really want power? Do they really want low strikeouts? Whatever it is. But then the other part, as I heard you correctly, is that, there may be things that are not captured in the overall future potential that are really important. So teams may, for instance, have a strong culture of minor league player development. And so they don't really care whether a player is coachable or not, because they have such faith in their minor league teams being able to develop a player, or the reverse. They might put a lot of faith into players who are seen to be coachable or pliable, or say aggressive, although aggressive is always one of those terms that all the players themselves laugh at, because if you're not aggressive, you're never going to play professional sports. So what does it mean to be, exceptionally aggressive? Does it mean you run over people at second base? What are they really talking about when they talk about aggressive? But nevertheless, you're exactly right. Teams will have conversations about that, about priorities. But typically the 2 ways they'll have conversations, the one is for who they're going to draft in the first 2, 3, 4 rounds, those really elite, top 50 players, top 100 players, top 150 players. Then they'll have a lot of conversations about who they want to draft first. But then the other time is when you're like round 20 and you have 40 guys you're trying to pick up between, and all 40 are 30 OFPs, and you really don't care. You might call up your low A rookie ball coach and ask if he needs a catcher. That's one way of deciding between them. And another way of deciding between them is exactly what you're talking about, deciding a kind of internal metric that a club would use and prefer certain players over others, all else being equal.
Did you find that they were scouting scouts and then using that to calibrate a
Yes.
scout's opinion?
Absolutely. So they keep track of scouts. Now, there's always, the old timers who kind of get brought in, and there's some kind of special status accorded to scouts, but the vast majority of working scouts, and certainly every scout who worked for the Major League Scouting Bureau, is evaluated precisely on the basis of the grades they're giving to previous major leaguers. And that's the way the clubs would talk about it, that the scouting reports are used to evaluate the scouts themselves. And some teams, like I'm thinking of the Chicago Cubs, they would require their scouts, not the Major League Scouting Bureau scouts, but the Chicago Cubs scouts would have to say whether this pitcher was a first, second, third, fourth, or fifth starting pitcher for the team. So they'd have to make predictions down to the level of whether it's second starting pitcher in a playoff series or fourth. Now, obviously, a scout watching a high school player pitch cannot do that. That is an insane thing to ask. But teams like the Cubs thought that if they required all this detail, all this data, they would then be able to make fine judgment about which scouts are better. So that's really what they were trying to do, is to grade the scouts on this basis and try and figure out which ones are good. The interesting thing about grading scouts, though, is that for most general managers, you want a scout who gives the exact same grades that you do. So that's ultimately what they want, right? If you're a general manager and you go watch someone play and you really like them, you want your scouts to also like him. And so that's the tendency that general managers and scouting directors are constantly fighting, is that your instinct is to have every single one in your organization grade players the same way. And then you still want people, of course, to push against that so that you don't have groupthink and all miss out on a real superstar who you should have seen, but you all just decided that he wasn't going to be worth it.
Well, that would bring some pressure into the profession of scouting, wouldn't it? I mean, to keep your job.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Scout's a tough job to keep. I mean, they tend to, when a new scouting director is brought in or a new general manager is brought in, they tend to clean house. And so scouts will tend to be loyal to certain scouting directors or certain general managers because they're constantly turnover on teams. They look to have scouts that they trust their judgment and trust the numbers that they're putting down on the page. So there's a lot of pressure. It's a tough business.
I have a question about scoring. To me, this year I noticed seemed like an unusual in the playoffs, an unusual number of base hits that were in fielders' gloves at one time went out. Is that a accurate type of observation, say maybe than 10 years ago? They seem to be more generous with the hits.
Yeah, that's a good. So, I mean, it's a good question because it also, things like the shift have come up a lot with official scorers. So if a third baseman is playing by himself between second and third base and a ball is hit to where he'd normally be playing, what do you call that? Or if a ball is hit, say, directly to second base and he fumbles it, but he's a third baseman, that's kind of crazy to expect him to get something at second base. And so the way those judgments are made is based on where they're positioned, when the pitch is made. And so one of the things that's happening is that because of shifts and ever more advanced defensive positioning, players are able to get to a lot more balls than they might have been able to get to before. But whether or not those are counting as hits, that depends on the scores. I will say in the playoffs, scoring is always a little dodgy because playoff scoring tends to be done by appointments, especially at the World Series level. And so those tend to be a little more honorific, whereas regular season scoring, they pay a lot more attention to than postseason scoring, at least at the main MLB offices. So you're going to see a lot more dodgy scoring rulings in the postseason than you would in the regular season. I think that answered your question, but if not, just follow up.
Well, we agree.
Okay.
Wait a minute. It's got you have a question.
All right.
Your Pittsburgh Pirates, what happened to them?
The Pirates. Yeah. So I haven't been in Pittsburgh my whole life. I've only been here. I've worked at Carnegie Mellon about 6 years now. So I have come to learn the kind of tragedy of the Pirates, in their ways. Although I grew up in Atlanta, so ironically, for at least part of my youth, the Pirates Atlanta rivalry in the National League West was, of course, of great interest. But the Pirates, the kind of interesting thing about the Pirates is that they don't have problems drafting people. They seem to have problems bringing people to potential once they draft. And so they're losing a ton of double, triple A and first year, second year superstars, essentially, who do not perform at that level for the Pirates. And then as soon as they step off, on the other side of the Allegheny, they perform like they are, God's gift to pitching. And so we got the Glasnows of the world, even if you, in case of outfielders, but even if you get rid of some of the chances of these things happening, or the use of sticky tack by certain unnamed pitchers who got a lot better when they signed to leave the Pirates, even if we forget that, for a moment, it's still, this is one of the signs of player development, that even if you have a top level player, if you can't bring him from that kind of quad A level stuck between AAA and Major League up to that regular Major League level, it doesn't really matter, because some other team's going to come in and poach it and use all your scouts, all your drafting, all your low A development is going to go to naught. And so I think that's their biggest problem right now. In addition to the fact they play in a small market, they don't know what they're doing. They have an owner who's not willing to spend money, et cetera, et cetera. But lots of teams have that. Cleveland has that, and they do a lot better than we do. I'll say that much. If we could turn into Cleveland or Tampa Bay, I'd be a very happy man. Sounds like that's the question. So thank you guys so much for listening, and I appreciate it. Yeah. Oh. The odd Zoom muted clapping. Indeed. All right. I hope you enjoy your rest of your meeting. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Okay. I might recommend you a couple of his favorite chapters, if you don't mind.
Feel free to. And yep, my email was in the slides, and Bob has it as well. All right. Take care.
Thank you. Right. Really good. Now you're kind of quiet.
No, I thought it was very good.
Pretty much on program, pretty much had it well spelled out. Yeah, when you get into scouting and evaluation, it really gets complex, and I just don't really, I don't care to take exception to what he had to say, but I thought he did a nice job with it. But there's a difference between the practicality and the theory.
Let's say you tend to forget as you're looking at an 18, 19-year-old kid and trying to think where they're going to be when they're 25. And it's just, even just watch just a college player go from a freshman to a sophomore to a junior in any sport, and they could become a ragweed better player in just those 2 or 3 years. I don't know how these guys can sit there and watch 3 or 4 games of a player and that's the final decision basically on whether a team moves with him or not. I mean, it's just kind of, it like the guy says, 95% of the time they don't make it. I guess it gets done, but it just seems like it's just the toughest thing you want to do.
I think the evaluators do a good job. So when you're considering they're looking at 17, 18-year-old kids at the high school level, obviously the emphasis is on college players today. That level of competition has a lot to do with it. Prior experience has a lot to do with it. Kids in California and Texas and Florida play a lot more baseball than somebody in Maine. Obviously, it's from that standpoint, weather comes into it, but basically, it's one thing to measure the physical attributes, and I think they do a pretty good job at that. What is hard to measure is how players are going to react from a standpoint of the competition. It's a far different game once you sign a pro contract, which as they say in other sports, the game speeds up. Well, it speeds up in baseball too from that standpoint. And in my own experience, I can think of countless examples of kids that we saw that were physically talented and just had difficulty adjusting and coping with the environment.
Well, they grew up and they're probably the best athlete at their school, and their failure rate was they never really struck out too much, never really overpowered.
Right.
And now they start getting a group with equal level players, then you're not, then you're mental and not so physical.
Point, that's a very common problem from the standpoint of players who have been stars in small high schools or at any high school, and they come into the pro ranks, and it's a lot different. And some of them just don't have the determination or the fortitude to handle it.
Like Bregman starting off major league career, 2 for 34 or something like that. I mean, it just looked like he was overmatched. I mean, some guys, I guess, would just, that'd be the end. You never hear from them again. And some guys have enough confidence in I guess the two.
Feel my responsibility is I wish we had more guys. But we're trying to crank this Dierker Champ program back up. We were really going strong before COVID, but now we're struggling to get teams and schools involved. It's basically from kids pitch level to through middle school level. And we're likely to need umpires and coaches. What Dierker's Champs is a program that I'm involved in through Sci-Hope. It's one of their programs, but what we try to do is enable kids that couldn't afford to play in the SABR league, be able to play for nothing. Provide the equipment, we provide the t-shirts with the names, we give kids a chance to be on a team and learn the things you learn from being on a team. Experience the fun that all the other kids that come from families where they can pay the $500 and take them to the batting cage every weekend. So, it's been very gratifying for me, and I'm a little I'm frustrated because the schools are struggling so much with their own teachers and their own problems that they're not getting kind of cooperation we were before. If anybody would consider that or knows anybody that would consider it, for coaches, you go to the school and do a practice once a week and go to a game on Saturday, and it starts at the beginning of March and ends at the end of May. So it's not a real big commitment, but you can picture what that environment is. You could probably tell whether you think you might like it or not, or somebody that might. The way that I like to bring that around scouting, which is also has a lot to do with the question before this, is that when we're trying to project what a kid can do, why do we see so many kids from the Latin American countries and now Asian countries as being a bigger and bigger percentage of the total population, that, as you will, from the Major League Baseball? When I was playing, there were a very high percentage of American blacks. Yeah, we don't have too many anymore. So I'm looking at these kids during the 3 or 4 years that we were growing and growing, and I've seen, may not seem like many because we had 375 kids the last, but I've seen 4 or 5 kids. Could be, I know they could play high school ball, maybe they could play college ball or even professional ball. They're just that good. But they're going to a high school and they're coming from a family where, what are they going to do? They could equally play basketball and be the star. They could play football and be the star. They play football, they're going to have a big crowd. If they play basketball, they're going to have a big crowd. If they go to play baseball, they're going to have, girlfriends, family. And that's about it. So I think we lose a lot of players that you could project as having potential greater than what you're seeing. Because I see these kids, they haven't played catch in the backyard with their dad. They haven't been to a batting cage. They just showed up there and they can run real fast. They can throw pretty well. And when they hit the ball, they hit it a little harder. I don't know where that goes. But the other thing I know that a lot of us that have watched a lot of baseball games and been out there and tried to play and know how difficult it is that a lot of times when you see a young guy and he's not a finished player, there's something about him that you like. And one example I would give is Hunter Pence. And the first couple times I watched him, I thought he was the most uncoordinated, ungainly looking baseball player I'd ever seen. He didn't know how to throw. He had a choppy swing. The more I watched him, his hitting reminded me of Andre Dawson. And I went, oh, but is it possible that he could? No, he would never throw that well, but he could run. And so it's when you're trying to figure out what a guy can be, you think of another player that you've seen from a previous generation and say, could this guy become that guy? And another thing, which is just for your general amusement, but it was something that I enjoyed hearing about Rod Carew, his rating. When I signed in '64, we all went to now they call it instruction week. We all stayed in the dorm and played each other every day. And it was the Twins, the Mets, the Tigers, and the Colt 45s. The Twins, their guy they just signed into Rod Carew. And I could have told everybody right then and there at the instruction league that Rod Carew was going to the big league pretty fast and he was going to be above average, not because he was pretty fast and above average on the baseball field, but because in a little lobby where they had a pool table and a ping pong table and a TV, nobody ever got more than 5 points off Rod Carew playing ping pong. He was just as depth with that ping pong paddle as he was with a baseball bat. And I could tell you from that athleticism, back from the table, up to the table, sideways, this way, that way. I mean, people would get around and watch him play ping pong. He got to the point where nobody wanted to play him.
Same thing with Joe Morgan. Joe Morgan, same way.
Yeah.
Same thing, long tennis, whatever.
Did anybody else in his family have that kind of athletic ability?
I don't know. I sat around and went through names. I those were the two that came
I just,
to me.
just an individual, or is it spread around everybody else?
Well, a lot of guys turn out to be good players that are not. They don't look like baseball athletes. Like Hunter Pence doesn't look like a baseball athlete.
He played about 20 years.
Yeah, maybe basketball or track or something, but the way he threw it, the way he swung, just looks like guys like that.
He loved it.
And then he opens a hitting school. Oh, what? Don't do what I did.
I was gonna ask Tal, did you have a stable of scouts that went around that you like to keep, or did you?
I was fortunate when I did, so when I was scouting director at the Astros. So we had a staff that put Pat Gillick, we know him, in the Hall of Fame, very successful general manager. Pat sort of started his career as a Stanton Houston. And Joe Wilson was the individual that led the Major League Scouting. And the information you see up there on their scouting reports and so on are all things that Jim basically took what we had established here in Houston. Stands in the late '60s, the Astros were the first club to initiate any kind of data processing on scouting. We actually had Laurie and Judy Vino as stands during games at night to sit down and keep all the stuff with it. And we were the first club to do it. And after we launched that, the Mets came down to see what we were doing. Other clubs took off from there, but a lot of the stuff that he refers to in his book and in his presentations, are things that were really formulated here in Houston. We had Gillick and Wilson and Charles Keel.
Yeah, and I was really connected to all of them. Wasn't technically Jim, but Jim Wilson was probably the cross checker. He was the guy that didn't see me the last couple of times before the draft or for free agent signing now. Well, he was the last guy to talk to me and try to sell the Colt 45. The guy from the Cubs was trying to sell the Cubs and got down to them. But then Carl Keel, I think Carl was the area scout at the time. And then he worked his way up to being manager of the Expos. Then he was managing the Expos when I pitched a no-hitter against You know, all these things, so they connected it. And then the other thing, and that if you wanted to look at it a different way, rather than the scouts that were with the Colt 45s and early Astros, other than the positions they eventually, what their career became of, would be just to look at the players that the Colt 45s and early Astros had, say between 1964 and 1971 or two. And if you just, I mean, you could put this is the interesting question to me, and I'm grateful for Roy Hopkins and all he did for the city and for the game of baseball, but I really believe that if he hadn't been able to buy the team from Bob Smith, that we wouldn't have made a lot of the trades we made in the late 60s, early 70s, and just by keeping the same guys we already had, that we may have a contending team.
Think Mike Quay already better than Kirk Leffert.
Yeah, Mike Sharon, third leverage, yeah, and the Morgan trade, of course, is the most obvious, but we made some good ones. We got Player and Gary Royce by trades. Traded them both, but
Yeah, the inception of the club is in 1961 through 1973. We signed and developed more major league players than anybody else.
So your answer, you didn't keep all the scouts because you were so successful.
They
Promoted, went on, you had to.
I left here in 73 to build the Yankees. And after I was there, I hired Gillick, got Gillick to leave and Troy was there. Sam Wilson went on to become general manager at Milwaukee, and Jim and I were very close friends. And I was with him the night that he debated whether to take on the Major League Scouting Bureau job. And he did, and the first person he brought in to assist him was Gordon Leigh, who got his start here as just a young scout, headed in with the Astros team. And then Jim Balmer was part of that staff, or that was him. He went on to become general manager of the Phillies. Dick Fogard also knows he went to work with the Scouting Bureau, and then it's at the Scouting Bureau in its early years wanted to attract a number of good people. But as they became well known, they would leave and join clubs for better position. As one of them was Dick Fogard. He became scouting director at Oakland. Randy Davis was another one. He became scouting director. So it just on that step very quickly. I named Gillick and Wilson and Leahy and Balmer and Bogart and Keel. There's half a dozen at least of our nucleus, and that's what enabled us to sign and develop all these players. One of those, unfortunately, let's end with Justice and Dave Aries and Stobbs and Morgan and all, and ended up else.
Raider, God Wills, Congress.
That's like.
If we just did nothing, we would have won more.
I think it was pretty interesting.
I just remember the Pat Gillick part was, I'm not sure what his job was at that time. When I reported to Coco for that instruction league, Pat Gillick was the one that picked me up at the airport. I was connected to all those guys. Okay.
I think it was pretty interesting to listen to him talk about scouts because I'm in high school and I play high school baseball, and you never know when there's somebody who's might be watching you. I think it was really interesting to hear about or hear what he's heard from scouts about what they look for and their methods and stuff and how their score sheets. It was pretty interesting. And it's probably something that was good for me to learn because obviously I want to play on a professional level, but it was really interesting. The how the score sheets work and what the scouts look for.
And the key is there's always somebody looking. Believe me, there are scouts there. They know who you are. They may not walk up and say hi, but they know who you are.
I'm gonna pop in and tell our friend Ryan who just talked. I'm gonna recommend that you read the book, Moneyball by Michael Lewis. If you haven't already, please read the book. You'll learn a lot.
And Jim DeShay told me one time that he grew up right on the Canadian, I guess, New Hampshire border. And he said, how did a scout ever find you when had snow on the ground all the time? And he said, if you can throw the ball 90 miles an hour, they will find you. And they did. Okay, it's terrific discussion. As Dirk said, I wish there were a few more people here because it's been quite entertaining and interesting. We have a book report. You want to make the book report, Tony? We got a few minutes.
Okay, where should I be?
We'll put the camera on you. Stand up.
Oh,
You stand up where you are. I think you'll be able to see, okay? It's depending on what you want to do.
Zoom in on you.
I don't know if we can zoom in.
Get close and watch it.
You may want to come close off if we can zoom in.
Yeah, I can't see it, Tony. Well,
not all together bad.
all right.
Where am I?
Where do you want to be?
Oh, I'll be next to Bob.
All right.
Just you want to share?
Whoa, it's right there. There you go. 75 minutes, you know that, Jim.
It's unfair. Thank you. Well, I was asked to do a book report, and the book I picked was The Life and Times of Babe Ruth by Leigh, and it's called The Big Bam. It's a delightfully entertaining book that was published a few years ago. And the author has done a life of Ted Williams. And his latest book is about the 1969 NBA playoffs between the Celtics and the Los Angeles Lakers. And he's a big basketball fan. He worked for a long time with the Boston Globe. So he's very familiar with the Boston Garden and Sweating Palace that it was. So it's a very interesting book. But I think this is really outstanding. And all about Ruth, of course. And I think everybody is pretty well familiar with his life history. He was born in 1895, died in 1948, about 53 years old. He was, his father ran a bar in Baltimore, and his father was killed in a street fight when he was very young. His mother died when he was pretty young. He had some brothers and sisters who died before he did. And his last sister died in 1991, so she lived a pretty long time. He was married a couple of times. His first wife it wasn't a shotgun marriage or anything like that, but he was free and easy. They had a farm out in outside of Boston. And years later, 1929, he and his wife were separated, and she was living with somebody. They thought he was a dentist or something like that. Anyway, big fire at the farm. She was killed, and it just broke him up. Same time, he was seeing a woman named Claire Hodgson, who had something of a show business career. She was a very attractive young woman, and when he finally married her after his first wife died, she really nailed him down and gave him a lot of direction in his life. So much so that it may have taken the life out of him a little bit. But for most of his life, he was larger than life. He had nothing as a kind of an orphan in St. Mary's Industrial School. They were put him there because his family background was so chaotic. But he stayed there for a long time. Not an orphan, But he also said that not many people came to visit him while he was there. So it was kind of pretty lonely, I think. But it turned out he was a terrific athlete at the school. And at some point he was, came under the fellow by the name of Jack Dunn, who found him. And Dunn owned the Orioles, the Baltimore Orioles International League. And he saw Ruth playing for St. Mary's Industrial School. And he's a terrific hitter. He's always a great hitter to hit the ball further than anybody ever hit the ball, I think. So Dunn liked him as a pitcher. And so he joined the Baltimore in the International League, 1914. And he racked up a really good record as a pitcher. And then later that year, he was sold to the Red Sox. Sold to the Red Sox as a pitcher. And he was an outstanding pitcher in the American League. And he won 20 games a few times. He had a remarkable record in the World Series. He was consecutive scoreless innings that lasted for a long time. And he was unhittable. He had some mound duels, as they used to call it, with Walter Johnson. He beat Johnson more than Johnson beat him, maybe 5 or 6 to 1. He was a good pitcher. He was not afraid of anybody. He'd throw at him too. But he had a good fastball. He struck out high cob. So he was really a good pitcher. Low ERAs, a lot of complete games. But it turned out he really was a fabulous hitter. As a pitcher, he was hitting home runs for the Red Sox. One year he hit about 5 home runs as a pitcher. And he's runner-up to the American League home run champ. He had 7. And this is back in the dead ball. And he had a terrific run in Boston. 1915, 16, 17, and 18, they were World Series champions. And in 1918, the manager was a fellow by the name of Ed Barrow, who I think is the Hall of Fame, who then moved on to the Yankees front office. And Barrow eventually yielded to Ruth's inclination to become a hitter. And 1919, playing no longer a pitcher at that time, the Red Sox were no longer a really good team. They finished out 4th or 5th. But in 1990, he set the American League or Major League home run record of 29 home runs. And they had to go all the way back to the home run totals in the late 1880s. And he surpassed that. Thank God, like Williams or Williamson, who had a short portion, might be able to get at. So it was enormously successful for the Red Sox. In 1919, the owner of the Red Sox, a guy by the name of Harry Frazee, he was always short of cash. The old story was that he needed some money to produce a musical called No No and Nets. The famous song there was Tea for Two in New York. But he also took out a loan from the Yankee management for $300,000. So that note was coming due and he had to sell an asset. So what he did was sell the Babe Ruth to the Yankees for $125,000. And then he moved to New York and the rest was more or less history. He was an amazing ball player, an amazing human being. He had an enormous appetite for everything because of his childhood, which was really limited as great in so many ways. He's, obviously set all-time World Series records consumption of hot dogs. Gargantuan appetite. He would party all night. He really liked women, lots of women, and he was in a way kind of uncouth. Some people didn't like him, some people loved him, but I thought I would read a few extracts of the book because they're really kind of nice. Talking about him as a pitcher, he writes that the pitcher who emerged was the players that faced him said that he was an easy 3/4 delivery, he threw hard. He definitely was a fastball pitcher. His fastball had a little hop, a jumping across the plate. He had a solid curveball mixed in with a changeup every once in a while. He was natural. No one gave him much of the way of instruction. And he had just enough wildness to make a batter feel uncomfortable. Listen here. There's he roomed with a guy by the name of Ernie Shore at the Red Sox. Shore was a college graduate. He did not last long as an early roommate of Ruth. He said in public that he didn't like Ruth using his toothbrush all the time. He said in public he didn't like Ruth for doing that, and he also didn't like a roommate who never flushed the toilet, who walked around naked, never sat down, never slept, and had a pride for personal flatulence and exaggerated belches. So it was it's kind of like the way Ruth was. Another player, Larry Gardner's wife, Margaret, remembered Ruth as follows. He was foul-mouthed, a show-off, very distasteful to have around. The kind of person you never dream of having for dinner. I suppose he was likable enough in his own way, but you can never prove it by me. His first wife was Helen, and at some point they went to the zoo and looked past the monkey cage. Ruth started jumping around in front of the cage doing monkey impressions. One of the monkeys started doing exactly what Ruth was doing. His wife said, "Look, babe, he knows you." So, so it's really good. So that was Ruth. Let me see here. He also knew a lot of baseball writers, including a guy by the name of Westbrook Pregler. In the 20s in New York, there were 18 daily newspapers, and Ruth was a terrific copy. He didn't remember anybody's name, but he would say and do anything. So that was always being reported. Pegler said that he goes to Ruth. He said he didn't like a lot of people and found the big man on close acquaintance to be unbelievably mean, foul-mouthed, and violent, according to Pegler. And Ruth contributed little to Pegler's reports beyond a telegram, reading something like this: "Hold 2 out of the park today, high fastball, send check immediately," because he goes right in column for it. So this was what he was doing. But he arrived on the scene in 1920. First year with the Yankees, he hit 54 home runs, which is more than almost every other club by himself. He was playing Fulham and had a fantastic season. The important thing there is that he arrived at the same time the White Sox scandal was breaking in the late summer of 1920. The White Sox and the Yankees were fighting with the Indians for first place. The scandal broke, and the White Sox lost most of their team, and they finished third, and the Yankees finished second because they had nobody to play ball for them at that time. So he arrived at exactly the time baseball needed somebody like that, because he was, as I say, bigger than life. Everybody followed him. Terrifically popular with a lot of folks, especially except if you're going to throwing a dinner party for you. He hired a guy by the name of Christy Walsh, who was his business agent manager, and made sure that he was in public press all the time, which was important to him at certain points in his career, because he just couldn't control himself. And also he ran afoul of the commissioner for many times, who didn't like the way that Ruth after the season would play these exhibition games. They could make a lot of money doing that, especially Ruth, because he played anywhere, everywhere with his team, played black teams, Hispanic teams, local teams, and made a lot of money. And the commissioner didn't like that, particularly if he was playing at a time when he was on the World Series team. They represented the American League in 1921 and 1922 against the Giants. Giants beat them badly both times. Then they played again in 23. And finally, the Yankees won the pennant. He liked high-powered cars. He liked a lot of them. He had a lot of accidents. One time he was driving somewhere in the rural Massachusetts, and he ruined his car and it crashed. And he told the guy, garage owner who picked it up, said, "You keep it. I'm tired of this one." So he had a lot of money. He would spend it freely. He had enormous debts. He liked to gamble. One time they were having I think spring training or some exhibition game in Nevada. You lost maybe maybe $500,000 in gambling tables there. And you must have paid it off somehow. No one really knows for sure. So, let's see, there was. This is the way he ran into Judge Mountain Landis. This is the writer's description of Landis. The federal judge, as a federal judge in Chicago, a district court judge, he had fined Standard Oil several $1 million in one of the first antitrust suits. And I think it might have reached the Supreme Court. He had been plucked by baseball owners from the U.S. District Court of Northern Illinois early in 1920, the year after the Black Sox scandal in Chicago. He was an odd, foul-mouthed little man, an ego-driven, tobacco-chewing Puritan with electric white hair shooting out over his head, a hanging judge with the wrath of God carved across his face. The best description of Landis was that he looked like Whistler's mother in slats. His favorite phrase when sentencing some seditionists, some violator of the Volstead Act, was to say, take that man up to Mabel's room, whatever that meant. So he got him out of there, but he cracked down on Ruth a lot of times. He suspended him in after the 1922 season. And he, I think he sat out maybe 7 weeks, finally, as I say, he finally won the pennant. But that was 1 year the Babers did not lead the league a whole month because he's not there for much of the season. So he had Ruth, as I said, liked to play exhibition games. This was what he report on what he did after the season. He left New York on October 11th, the day after the World Series, accompanied by Bob Buesel and Christy Walsh. He returned to New York on December 6th, accompanied by Walsh. Buesel remained in Los Angeles. So they covered 8,500 miles of the road trip. He played 15 cities in 6 days. He got 17 home runs in 15 games. He drew 125,000 fans. The game for under the auspices of a leading newspaper in each city with the banking one the following organization: Elks, Ions of Columbus, or American Legion. He made 22 speeches at breakfast, lunch, and dinners, and banquets given in his honor. 7 speeches were given from Pullman platforms. He rode 250 miles on a locomotive through Montana. He autographed nearly 5,000 baseballs. He headed 4 parades accompanied by mayors and city officials. He wore his dinner coat 19 times, complained of so few opportunity to do so. 2 years he considered dinner coats something to be avoided. He wore silk out once. Someone said he looked good in it, so he bought it. He refereed a 4-round bout in Hollywood, California, was presented with a wristwatch by the American Legion. He batted 1,000 autographed baseball to 10,000 Los Angeles school kids and nearly fell off a roof at the grandstand. He beat Douglas Fairbanks in a game of what was called dong, similar to tennis. The railroads refused to take his money for food. The hotel gave him rooms for nothing. He was Jack Dempsey's guest in Los Angeles. He drove a golf ball 353 yards, the course record at Rancho Golf Club in Los Angeles. He visited 18 hospitals and orphan asylums. He posted nearly 250 photographs in New York City. He struck out twice with 3 men on base. He failed to get a home run in Tacoma, Kansas City, Stockton, Los Angeles, and San Diego. He got 17 home runs in Altoona, Minneapolis, Spokane, Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Santa Barbara. He won 4 Buffalo Stakes in 1 deal. He talked over the radio at San Francisco for 12 minutes before he knew he was being framed. He refused to wear a nightgown on pajamas at any time. He established distant records at 5 ballparks. He was a live member of the Lions Club. His last game was in the smallest city, Bray, near Fulton, California. And finally, on October 31st, Ruth played at the Los Angeles Theater. He was about 10 pounds overweight, otherwise in fine shape.
What year was that?
This was about 1922, 23. So he's really famous. He went out to Hollywood and made a couple of movies. I think they've been terrible. Well, they're not considered classics now.
There's a picture of him in the Langer Hotel lobby hall, way as far with the 22 Yankees.
Oh, yeah, probably.
Dead center, got his arms folded, he's got his feet spread like wider than his shoulders. you're not gonna miss it. I'm standing there on the, in front of everybody, but no doubt he was the star of the team.
Oh, yeah.
But they were playing exhibition. He was there for an exhibition in 1922.
Okay, I'm going to finish up real quick, Bob.
Yes, that'd be good.
Okay. By the way, I think at the University of Texas in the gymnasium, I think they had a ball that Ruth hit out of this field when he was with the exhibition game. So it was in Austin, Texas somewhere. So he was active, always hitting a lot of home runs. In 1933, when he was on decline, he was still the highest paid ball player in the major leagues, at maybe $35,000. That's in the midst of the Depression. The last years were melancholy. He finished out with the Boston Braves, hit 3 home runs in one of his last appearances in Pittsburgh, and just kind of whittled away. He wanted to become a manager. The Yankees wouldn't give him the time of day, neither would anybody else. And he had a short stint as a coach for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1938. That was the last time, I guess, that he lived out the rest of his life until 1948, but he had suffering from cancer. It really just ate him up. And died in 1948. There was a service at funerals at the Yankee Stadium. All the friends showed up there. A very hot day. The story is that one of his old teammates said to Herb Pennock, "God, Herb, it's so hot out here. I could use a beer." And Pennock probably said, the babe could too. So that's a really fine book. It's really entertaining. Oh,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
we'll be back.
They've had a lot of stories about it. Most of them are true. Thank you. Okay, very good. Okay. Next meeting will be the 14th of December, which is a Tuesday. And you can see we've already gone all out with the decorations already up. I do have a little something for the 3 people. I've got the World Series program for this year. For those anyone who's interested, Mr. Dierker already has one, but anybody want one? Got 3. 1, 2, 3.
I actually got.
Thank you, Bob. Wow.
Well, I heard.
It's like too slow, too slow.
Those are Kirk and Gene Dias, who was the Vice President of Communications for the Astros. He gave them.
He's our speaker next month.
I'm glad you asked, because I've already changed the date on twice. I hope he's flexible enough to come the 3rd time. He's going to talk about the shooting of a Chicago Cub in 1932. And the name escapes me. What's his name, Scott? What's the name of our speaker to the newsletter? That's Scott. He's a good speaker. Joe can look it up real quick.
Players said he's speakers.
No, that's
Bales. Bales.
1932. Wait, it's 1940.
Robert Redford.
It's Jack Bales. It's a speaker. Speaking on Billy Turgis, his book on Billy Turgis, the Chicago Cubs Shot for Love.
Jack Bills. Yeah, Jack White Bills. Yeah, Jack Bill.
Bales.
Jack. I call him Jack. Thank you, Ryan.
Yes.
Okay, guys. And Martha's not here. She's in Baltimore. She told me she wouldn't be here. Brownie's not here, but need to encourage some more people to come out. With a meeting like we had tonight, I thought he was spectacular. Chris was really terrific. Really, and it came across so well.
It's some of your guys. Astros. That was very good.
But that's how things work. The book is terrific. You can get it on Amazon for $16. Cal's already got it. I've got it. Who's the author? Christopher Phillips. Yeah.
Yeah. The name of the book for next month?
Scouting and Scoring.
I think the title of the book for next month is fascinating.
Tell them what it is.
The Chicago Cub Shot for Love, a showgirl's crime of passion in the 1932 World Series. He's made it very interesting.
I don't know if Ryan's heard it or not, but he made this presentation of several other Sabre chaps.
Yes.
Really good.
Yes, I've heard it, and he is very good. He is very good, and he'll certainly milk that. He'll certainly milk it for all it's worth. It'll be a fun presentation.
Thank you.
It's the winner of tonight's trivia. Well, copy that book.
Say, you heard that from Greg? Oh, I called him at 7 o'clock and didn't answer, which is not Greg looking. I had a Facebook from him a couple of days ago. He was talking about Butler and his high school class. So maybe he's up there. I don't know, but it's not like him. If he got the notice on the meeting, but he'll be the trivia guy next time. And we'll have to have a penalty for him. Run an extra lap. Any questions, comments? Read the newsletter, it's really good. And we welcome comments. Any other comments you'd like to make about our group?
Oh, I know, it's fantastic. I enjoyed very much being there. I love hearing all about the book, Babe Ruth book, my favorite line about Babe Ruth was when he was negotiating his contract, maybe this was in the book. Supposedly, the general manager of the Yankees said, he goes, Babe, he goes, that's more than the president of the United States makes. Babe Ruth said, well, I had a better year.
Thanks for coming. It's lovely to join. You can join us tonight if you like. Favor.org is all you have to do, right? Just like that. All right. So, good to see everybody. Have a happy Thanksgiving.
Same to you.
And see you later. Thanks, Tom. Take care.
Thank you.
What do you think we get ready? Shoot you early. You're lucky guy.
That was exactly. She's on the wall. She's got one boy up in the ground.